The first shot cracked through the trees so suddenly that I didn't know whether it split the air or my nerves first. A second shot followed, sharper, closer, snapping past my ear with a hiss that felt like a warning meant only for me. Men shouted, boots scraping against roots and wet leaves as the orderly column erupted into chaos. My musket nearly slipped from my hands as someone collided with my shoulder, shoving me toward the cover of a fallen log. The world spun in green and brown flashes, branches whipping past, mud splattering, leaves bursting upward as bullets tore into the ground. "Down! Take cover!" an officer yelled, though his voice vanished beneath the violent chatter of gunfire. The forest had swallowed us whole. One moment we were marching in steady formation, the morning still heavy with dew, and the next we were trapped in a thicket of shadows and gun smoke, unable to tell where the shots were coming from. The trees distorted every sound, turning each crack of a rifle into a dozen echoes. Someone screamed behind me. Another voice shouted, "Where are they? I can't see them." I pressed my back against the cold bark of a massive oak, trying to steady my breathing as leaves drifted down from fresh bullet strikes above my head. The smell of gunpowder spread through the damp air, sharp and choking. Jensen slid into cover beside me, panting hard. "They've hit us on the flank," he said, his voice cracking with adrenaline. I nodded, gripping my musket tighter. "How many?" "No idea," he whispered. "But they know exactly where we are." A bullet smacked into the tree between us. With a violent thud, splinters exploded into my cheek, burning like tiny sparks. Thompson dove into the underbrush a few yards away, shouting over the chaos. "They're in that thicket. I saw movement right side." Larson answered with a shot, the muzzle flash briefly lighting his terrified face. "Then fire back. Keep their heads down." Sound the air around us erupted as more rifles cracked from unseen positions. Smoke drifted through the branches, carried by the light breeze, blurring the shapes of men and trees alike. The forest had become a shifting maze of shadows, gun smoke, and noise, each moment stretching into something unsteady and unreal. I rose just enough to see over the fallen log. Something moved between the pine's dark cloth. A quick silhouette, then vanished again. I fired instinctively, the recoil slamming back into my shoulder. My ears rang, drowning out the shouts for a heartbeat. A Union soldier stumbled nearby, clutching his arm as blood seeped between his fingers. Another crawled behind a stump, dragging a wounded man whose boot left a long streak through the leaves. Their shots came in short, deliberate bursts, each one aimed, each one meant to break our line before it even formed. Jensen raised his rifle and fired across the glade. "I see one," he yelled. The reply came instantly. A crack rang out from the thicket, louder than the rest. Something jerked Jensen backward. His musket fell from his hands. He collapsed beside me, gasping. "Jensen!" I grabbed him by the coat, pulling him into cover. Where are you hit?" He winced, pressing a trembling hand to his side. "Ribs, maybe lower. I can't tell. Up my throat." Bullets ripped through the underbrush behind us, stitching the ground with small eruptions of dirt and leaves. I shielded him with my body, even as my mind screamed for me to move, to fight, to do something other than tremble. Thompson shouted over the gunfire. "We've got wounded. We need to fall back." Larson fired another shot into the trees, shouting, "They'll cut us to pieces if we run blind." Jensen's breaths came short and fast, each one a small, painful sound. "We have to move," I murmured. "If we stay, they'll pin us here." He gritted his teeth. "I can walk. Just help me up." I slipped my arm under his and lifted. He groaned but rose, leaning heavily against me as another volley cracked from the enemy line. Leaves showered down in a flurry as rounds tore into the branches overhead. My legs shook as we stumbled behind another line of trees, the world narrowing to Jensen's weight, the pounding of my heart and the relentless crack of rifles echoing through the forest. Men were regrouping behind a small rise ahead, officers waving frantically for us to fall back to a more defensible position. Dozens of bluecoats sprinted between trees, sliding behind stumps and logs, shouting directions through the din. "Move! Move! Get to the ridge!" Thompson appeared beside us, firing blindly into the smoke. "Come on, we're pulling back. They're trying to flank us." Every breath tasted of powder and fear. Every sound felt like it came from everywhere at once. We broke into the clearing just as a final volley tore into the trees behind us, sparking against trunks and chewing into the earth where we had been moments before. Somehow we were still alive. Somehow we had reached the others. But the battle was far from over. Mine nescent. As Union lines reformed on the low ridge, the realization struck me with a cold, steady clarity. This wasn't like Bull Run. This time, we weren't running in fear. This time, we were fighting back. We reached the low ridge in a stumbling rush, breathless and shaken, the sound of rifle fire still cracking like dry branches behind us. Men threw themselves behind trees, rocks, anything they could use for cover, their boots skidding across damp leaves. Officers shouted for order, the urgency in their voices cutting through the chaos like the sharp edge of a blade. Jensen leaned against me, clutching his side with trembling fingers. His breath came in shallow bursts, each one tight with pain. I lowered him beside a mound of roots where the earth had risen around a fallen tree, its bark rough and cool beneath his back. "I'm still here," he muttered, attempting a faint smile. Don't look so damned worried." "I'll stop worrying when you stop bleeding," I answered. He huffed a weak laugh, though the sound dissolved into a groan. Around us, the regiment scrambled to form a firing line. Some crouched behind the ridge, rifles ready, others knelt in the leaves, ramrods working frantically as they reloaded. Smoke drifted upward from spent volleys, forming a thin curtain that blurred the trees below. Thompson slid down beside us, musket barrels smoking. "They're pushing harder than I thought," he said. "They know this ground better than we do." Larson dropped to one knee nearby, checking his cartridge box. "They chose the ambush. We didn't." His voice was steady, but his hands shook. Another volley cracked from the thicket below. Bullets tore through branches above our heads, snapping wood into jagged fragments that fell in sharp little bursts around us. One struck the log behind me with a sickening thud, embedding itself deep into the bark. "Return fire," an officer shouted. "Aim at the flashes, don't shoot blind." Dozens of muskets lifted. A series of bright flares burst from the shadows in the trees below. We fired back in unison, the recoil slamming into my shoulder, the blast momentarily drowning out every other sound. Smoke exploded outward in rolling waves, carried by the shifting wind. The thicket ahead became nearly invisible through the haze, a shifting ghost of branches and shadows. But beneath it, movement stirred shapes darting, rifles flashing. Men shouted for ammunition runners as the firefight intensified. Ramrods clanged against barrels. Hot powder burned the air, stinging my nose and eyes. The forest had become a furnace of smoke, noise, and fear. Jensen groaned again, gripping my sleeve. "Go. Go help them," he whispered. "Don't stay here with me." "I'm not leaving you," I said, loading another round. "You have to fight," he muttered. His voice trembled, but not with fear, with frustration, with pride, with the stubbornness that had carried us from Minnesota to this cursed forest. I swallowed hard, forcing the rising panic back down. He was right. If the line broke here, none of us would get out. I set my jaw and rose just enough to peer over the ridge. The Confederates were pressing forward, their figures flickering between pines in brief glimpses, grey coats blending with bark, faces half hidden by smoke, rifles flashing in the dim light. They advanced cautiously, using the terrain with practiced ease. They wanted to force us off this ridge, to scatter us into the forest. "Hold the line," an officer bellowed. "Make them pay for every inch." Larson fired again, teeth clenched. "They're getting too close," Thompson answered with a grim nod. "And we don't let them get the rest of the way." The next volley we delivered was tighter, more deliberate, the kicks of our muskets lined up in near unison, the sound crashing like a low thunderclap across the ridge. Branches snapped violently in the thicket as rounds found their mark. For a heartbeat, the enemy advance faltered. I reloaded, hands trembling, powder spilling slightly from the cartridge, sweat mixed with smoke and dirt across my forehead, stinging my eyes, my heart hammered so hard I could feel each beat echo in my ribs. The enemy answered with another volley. A streak of lead hissed past my face, close enough that I felt the heat of its passing. Another round struck a soldier, 2 men down, spinning him backward into the leaves with a cry. Blood sprayed across the roots, dark and quick. Someone dragged him behind the ridge, shouting for help. Thompson shot a worried glance at Jensen. "He holding on? He's alive," I said. "That's all that matters right now." Jensen forced a weak grin. "Don't let them win on my account. His spirit steadied something inside me. Fear still gnawed at my insides, but now it drove me forward instead of freezing me. Determination took root in its pace, rough, imperfect, but solid. I rose again, lining up my next shot through the smoke. On my mark, an officer called, "Fire!" The volley erupted like a rolling wave. Through the drifting haze, I saw Confederate shapes pulling back, vanishing behind thicker brush where the ground dipped sharply downward. The pressure on our line eased, but only slightly. They weren't retreating for good, just regrouping, just waiting to strike again with fresh position and better aim. Each heartbeat of quiet that followed felt poised on a knife's edge. Nam Thompson leaned close. "They'll try again. You know that." "I do," I said, "and we'll be ready for them." A courier sprinted past, mud flying from his boots as he carried word to another company on our right flank. The regiment was bracing for the next push, each man tightening his grip on his musket, eyes fixed on the shifting shadows below. I crouched beside Jensen for a moment. His breathing was steadier now, though still shallow. He managed to whisper, "Don't get yourself killed." "I'll try not to," I said softly. Above us, a gust of wind cut through the smoke, revealing the forest floor once more dark, tangled and waiting. The thicket seemed almost to breathe with hidden movement, and as the next crack of enemy fire tore through the silence, I felt it, not despair, not panic, but something sharper, clearer. Determination. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. The next volley from the enemy came with brutal precision, tearing through branches and scraping bark from the trees above our position. Leaves rained down in a frantic cascade, drifting onto us like a false calm as the air cracked again with gunfire. The Confederates had repositioned, firing from new cover that made their shots tighter, sharper, and far more punishing. "Here!" Neutral officers shouted along the ridge, their voices lifting above the chaos as they steadied the wobbling line. "Hold your fire until you see the flashes," one yelled, pacing behind the men. Another raised his sword to point down the slope, guiding fire into the densest part of the thicket where movement darted like shadows with rifles. Men shifted into firmer positions, bracing elbows against roots and trunks as they steadied their muskets. Boots dug into the damp earth, knees sinking slightly into mud, each man fighting for stability in the uneven ground. Breaths came in short bursts, sharp with fear, but the line no longer wavered the way it had in the initial ambush. Thompson knelt beside a stump, firing into a cluster of pines. "They're trying to turn our flank," he shouted. Larson gritted his teeth. "Not if we beat them to it." He leaned out and fired again, smoke bursting from the muzzle in a violent cloud. The enemy fire intensified, bullets streaking past us with a high whistling hiss that sent a shudder down my spine each time one passed too close. A round struck the ridge between my boots, spraying dirt into my face. Another clipped a branch overhead, sending it crashing down near Thompson's leg. "Steady," an officer called. "Steady, now give them disciplined fire." I inhaled deeply, forcing my trembling hands to slow as I loaded another round. The familiar ritual steadied me. Tear the cartridge, pour the powder, ram the ball, bring the musket to shoulder. Smoke burned in my throat, but I locked my jaw and ignored the sting. I rose just enough to peer over the ridge. The thicket writhed with motion shapes darting between trees, glimpses of grey, the glint of metal catching through the haze. I caught sight of a muzzle flash and fired, the recoil jerking my shoulder back hard. Next to me, Larson muttered a breathless curse. "They're closer than before." Thompson nodded grimly. "They're testing us, trying to see if we break." The Confederates surged again, a sudden burst of movement and fire from the lower slope. Shots slammed into the ridge, splintering roots and gouging clumps of earth from the slope. A man to my right cried out and fell back, clutching a bleeding shoulder. Another soldier dragged him behind cover, shouting for a medic over the gunfire. "Return fire," came the command. "Make every shot count." Neutral, our volley clapped out with surprising unity, a heavy, rolling sound that echoed through the forest like distant thunder. Smoke erupted from the ridge, sweeping down the slope in great drifting sheets. Through the haze, I saw several Confederate figures stumble back, disappearing into the undergrowth. For the first time since the ambush began, the pressure on our line eased. Not broken, just eased. I looked down at Jensen, his face pale but steadier. His hand still pressed to his side, but his eyes were open, focused, less clouded with pain than before. "Still fighting," he whispered. "Still standing," I answered. Another sudden crack echoed through the trees, followed by the rustle of movement deeper in the thicket. The Confederates were regrouping, shifting positions, searching for another angle to break us. The momentary lull felt like the pause between a predator's breaths. They won't give up, not after hitting us like that. No, Larson agreed, but they didn't expect us to hold. Officers repositioned companies along the ridge, plugging small gaps where wounded had been pulled back. Fresh lines formed behind us, ready to rotate forward if the front rank buckled. Reinforced, steadied, the ridge began to feel less like a place of retreat and more like a place of defiance. Men exchanged brief glances, fearful, tense, determined. A sense of unity settled over us, binding the line together with something stronger than orders. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where every breath feels borrowed, every leaf feels watched. I tightened my grip on my musket, heart pounding hard enough that I felt each beat in my fingertips. Somewhere below, branches cracked softly once, twice, followed by a muffled whisper of boots brushing earth. "They're moving again," Thompson muttered. Larson raised his musket, eyes narrowed. "They're gearing up for another push. They're gearing up for another push now." The panic that had nearly overtaken me at the ambush's start had been burned away by smoke, noise, and grim necessity. What took its place wasn't confidence. It was something heavier, sharper, more rooted. Determination. Jensen's faint voice drifted up from behind the roots. You hear me hold this line." "I will," I whispered, more to myself than to him. Mr. Head, the thicket below stirred again, a ripple of movement, flash of grey, the glint of metal. And then the sound came, a ragged, rising shout from Confederate throats, cutting through the forest like a blade. "Here they come," Thompson yelled. Officers roared their commands. "Stand firm, present arms, present arms," and as the next volley of enemy fire tore through the smoke and the figures surged toward the ridge, I felt my fear harden into something resolute. Whatever happened next, the line would hold. We would make it hold. The Confederate charge struck the ridge like a hammer crashing against iron. Their shout rolled up the slope in a guttural wave, fierce and uneven, as bodies broke from the shadows and surged through the underbrush. Bayonets glinted between the trees. Footsteps thundered against the earth. The forest seemed to lurch forward with them. "Steady the line," an officer screamed, his voice cracking with urgency. Muskets rose in shaking hands, barrels leveled down the slope at the advancing shapes. Smoke curled around us, thick and acrid, stinging the inside of my throat as I fought to breathe. Fear clawed at my ribs, but my fingers tightened around the musket and refused to let go. Fire! The volley erupted in a blinding flash. Flame burst from dozens of barrels, the recoil slamming into our shoulders as a rolling wave of sound tore down the ridge. I saw figures drop, some instantly still, others twisting backward into the ferns below, but many kept coming, too many. Their return fire crashed into us almost simultaneously. Bullets screeched past, slamming into trunks, cracking branches, and kicking leaves into the air. A man 2 spots to my left spun violently and fell, his musket flying from his hands as he crumpled with a sharp cry. Thompson shouted above the noise. "They're pushing the center. Don't let them break through." Larson gritted his teeth, raising his musket again. "Then hold them. Hold them." Men reloaded with frantic jerking motions, powder spilling from trembling fingers. Some bit cartridges open with teeth clenched so hard they tore their lips. Smoke rose in choking waves, drifting between us and the enemy, turning the world into a shifting grey curtain. I loaded and fired again, the recoil jarring my shoulder. Through the drifting haze, I saw a Confederate soldier burst from the thicket, charging uphill with his bayonet lowered. I fired instinctively. He fell, rolling into the brush. Another took his place. The enemy was close, terrifyingly close. Their shouts grew louder, sharper, cutting through the thick smoke like knives, slicing through cloth. Every heartbeat thudded like cannon fire inside my chest. "Keep firing," an officer barked. "Don't give them room to breathe." Volley after volley blasted into the mass of grey shapes swirling below. Each shot kicked more smoke into the air, until the ridge felt like the inside of a burning forge. We could barely see 10 yards ahead, yet the enemy's charge continued to press through the haze. And then the worst sound rose from the right flank, a wavering, panicked cry. "They're breaking our line, they're breaking through on the right." My stomach clenched. If the right side collapsed, the Confederates would spill behind us, rolling up the line like canvas in a storm. Every man on this ridge would be trapped. Thompson shot me a grim look. "If they break us here, that's it. Then they don't break us," I answered, surprising even myself with the hardness in my voice. And, neutral, I rose from behind the root, leveled my musket, and fired into the densest part of the charge. The recoil slammed into me, nearly knocking me off balance. I dropped back into cover, coughing on powder smoke. Larson reloaded rapidly beside me, hands shaking but determined. "They're losing steam," he muttered. "We've hit them hard." But the words were barely out before another surge of grey coats broke from the smoke, rushing up the slope with renewed fury. A rifle cracked so close to me that my ears rang sharply, the sound drilling through my skull. Heat burst past my cheek, another bullet had missed me by inches. I stumbled sideways, heart pounding, vision blurring momentarily from the shock. Thompson grabbed my arm to steady me. "Stay with it. Stay with it." I forced myself up again, reloading in jerking motions. My fingers were numb, my hands slick with sweat and powder residue. Yet I kept going, cartridge, powder, ball, ram, raise, fire. The motion became survival itself. The line roared again with another volley. The Confederate charge faltered, just barely, but noticeably. Several fell. Others dropped behind stumps and rocks, firing desperately uphill. The ridge held. Barely, but it held. Officers called down the line. Forward grew 2 steps, tightened ranks. Men shuffled closer, reforming the ragged line into something solid again. Shoulder to shoulder, we braced ourselves as the smoke thinned just enough to reveal the ground below. The Confederate charge had stalled. Bodies lay scattered among the roots and brambles. The survivors had taken what cover they could find, firing fewer shots now, short bursts instead of a rolling storm. Their shouts had faded. Thompson exhaled shakily. Is that it? Did we stop them? Larson kept his musket raised. For now. Now, the forest grew oddly quiet again, smoke curling through the still air, as if unsure where to settle. The silence felt wrong-forced, uneasy, the kind of calm that slips in only because the storm has paused, not passed. Men coughed, wiped blood or dirt from their faces, checked their cartridge boxes. I looked back at Jensen. His eyes were open, watching me. He managed a faint, pained smile. "You're still here," he whispered. "So are you," I said. A shot cracked suddenly from the thicket, snapping a branch above my head and dropping it at my feet. Another followed, then another. The enemy wasn't done. They were testing us, probing for weakness. Thompson cursed under his breath. "They're regrouping. They want another go." Larson nodded grimly. "They won't quit until we make them." Neutral, I tightened my grip on my musket, feeling the trembling in my arms, the ache in my shoulder, the sting of powder in my eyes. Fear still crawled inside me alive, insistent, impossible to ignore. But something else rose to meet it. Determination, sharp, hard, unyielding. Jensen's earlier words echoed in my mind, "Don't let them win on my account." The shadows below shifted again, branches parted, rifles lifted, and the next wave of gunfire erupted from the trees, signaling that the fight was far from finished. The next burst of Confederate fire ripped through the thinning smoke, but it lacked the brutal force of the earlier volleys. The shots came scattered, uneven, as if the enemy's rhythm had faltered under the weight of their own losses. Still, each crack sent a jolt of adrenaline surging through my chest. Now officers sensed it immediately, the weakening pressure, the slowing pace of the assault. They moved along the ridge with renewed urgency, their voices sharp and commanding as they reorganized the battered line. "Ready yourselves? This is our moment," one shouted, sword lifted high. Larson flicked a look at Thompson. "They're tiring." Thompson nodded, "which means we hit them before they find their breath again." I felt the truth settle over me like weight redistributing in armor. The enemy had pushed hard, hoping to break us. They hadn't, and that meant the next move belonged to us. Another volley came from the thicket, but it was ragged, scattered, men firing from cover, rather than a coordinated charge. The smoke above them drifted thinly now, no longer fed by continuous volleys. Shapes ducked behind stumps, fading rather than advancing. "Fix bayonets," an officer roared. The metallic rasp of steel sliding along barrels rippled down the line, a sound that cut through the haze like a warning bell. My own hands trembled as I locked the bayonet into place. the steel tip catching a glint of pale light between drifting smoke. Jensen stirred behind me, voice weak. What's happening? We're pushing them back, I said. He blinked slowly. Good. Don't let them come again. His words fueled something fierce inside me, a need not just to survive, but to protect the wounded man behind me, the man who had marched beside me since Minnesota. Fear sharpened into a point, determination hardened like iron around it. Advance by rushes, an officer commanded, left company first move. The company to our left surged forward in a low, controlled run, spreading out as they moved down the slope. They reached the first line of fallen logs and halted, firing a coordinated volley into the brush. Confederate shapes scattered like startled deer. Center company advance. Our turn. I rose, feeling the burn in my thighs as I broke into a crouched run, Jensen's labored breaths echoing behind me like a promise I couldn't ignore. Larson and Thompson ran on either side of me, their boots thudding against the churned earth. We reached the fallen logs and dropped behind them, muskets snapping up. Burst of enemy fire met us, clipping bark from the logs and showering us with splinters. One round struck the log beside Thompson's hand, embedding itself deep with a jarring crack. He flinched, then growled through gritted teeth. Return fire, we fired into the shadows, the flashes from our muzzles lighting the haze in short, violent bursts. The enemy fire slackened further, their shapes blurred backward deeper into the trees. Dare immense again, we pressed forward, stumbling over roots and uneven ground. The forest closing around us in twisting, tangled shapes. Branches slapped against my coat as I pushed forward, breathing hard. The smoke thinned as we descended, the deeper woods swallowing it. Keep them moving, an officer shouted. Don't let them reform. But even as we advanced, the uncertainty of every shadow gnawed at me. The Confederates were retreating, but retreat could hide traps just as easily as defeat. Every step forward felt like stepping into a question the forest had not yet answered. Larson raised his rifle. They're falling back toward that gully. Thompson fired a shot that echoed flatly against the distant slope. They're leaving in a hurry. Neutral. I scanned the tree line, searching for the next flash. The next movement, my pulse loud enough to drown the fading crack of rifles. But the forest had begun to swallow the enemy whole. Only scraps of grey coats flickered between trunks before vanishing entirely. The final shots came from deep within the woods, thin and scattered, like aftershocks of a passing storm. Then silence returned, but not the peaceful kind. The silence of battle's wake, of uncertainty hovering like smoke that refused to dissipate. We halted on a shallow rise overlooking the gully. The skirmish line broken, their retreat had become a full withdrawal. Officers raised their hands, signaling a stop. Hold position, do not pursue into unknown ground. A collective exhale rippled through our ranks. Some men dropped to one knee, gasping. Others leaned heavily on their muskets, sweat streaming down dust-streaked faces. Larson sank against a stump, breathing hard. Thompson wiped soot from his brow. Damn, they nearly had us. Nearly, Larson replied, but not today. My own legs trembled with the fading adrenaline, the fear that had driven me now draining into an ache that reached deep into my bones. But beneath it all, another feeling flickered, a fragile, stubborn spark of pride. We had held. We had fought back, and we had made them run. I looked back toward the ridge where Jensen lay. He watched us from the distance, pale but upright, his hand raised weakly in acknowledgement. I felt my throat tighten. We'd survived the worst of it. Be neutral. But as I scanned the forest ahead, listening to the wind shift through the pines, I knew this was only the beginning. The Confederates would return. The peninsula would not let us pass without more blood. And Yorktown waited just ahead. A fortress of earthworks, guns, and ghosts. The counterpush had ended, but the campaign, the real campaign, was only just beginning. The forest slowly returned to itself as the gunfire faded, the echoes drifting away like ghosts dissolving into the trees. Smoke lingered above the ground in thin, wandering ribbons curling through the roots and stumps left scarred by the exchange. The air still tasted of powder and burnt wood, heavy and metallic on the tongue. Men lowered their muskets, hands shaking from the strain of the fight, and the adrenaline still coursing through their limbs. Some stared blankly at the place where the Confederates had vanished. Others leaned forward with elbows on knees, catching their breath in long, ragged pulls. No one celebrated. No one smiled. We had held the line, but at a price none of us yet understood. Thompson let out a slow exhale. "Feels too damn quiet," he muttered. "Like the woods are waiting for us to turn our backs." Larson nodded, wiping soot from his cheek. "They'll be back eventually. But not today." His voice carried a heavy relief, slipped beneath the grit. We were ordered back to the ridge where the wounded had been gathered. The walk uphill was slow, heavy with exhaustion, our boots dragging through churned earth and shattered branches. Every fallen leaf seemed coated in a thin layer of ash. As we crested the ridge, I spotted Jensen propped against the roots of the old tree. A medic knelt at his side, wrapping cloth tightly around his wound. Jensen's face was pale, but his eyes were alert, and the sight of them nearly pulled a sound of relief from my chest. I hurried to him, heart pounding faster with each step. "Jensen," I said, dropping beside him, "you're still with us." He managed a faint smile. "Barely, but I'm not going anywhere yet." His breath hitched as the medic cinched the bandage. "It's a deep graze," the medic said. "He's lucky. Another inch and—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I nodded, swallowing hard. "Can he march?" "Not far," the medic answered, "but we'll get him moved with the train." Jensen closed his eyes briefly, his fingers trembling as he rested them over the fresh bandage. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "Slowed the whole line, didn't I?" "No," I said firmly. "You didn't slow anything. You're the reason I kept going." His eyes flickered open. He said nothing, but the look he gave me said everything. Around us, men checked on friends gathering near the ridge with the hollow quiet of those who'd seen enough for one day. Some shared canteens. Others sat in silence. Others sat in silence. The forest hummed softly with wind through branches, its earlier violence absorbed into the ground. A few bodies lay covered with blankets. Even without seeing their faces, the sight pressed a cold weight against my sternum. Larson walked past us, shaking his head slowly. "Didn't think they'd hit us so hard," he murmured. "Thought we were past the worst of it after Bull Run." Thompson adjusted his cartridge box. "This ain't like Bull Run," he said softly. "We're fighting differently now. Standing differently." His words echoed inside me. He was right. At Bull Run, panic had scattered us. Here, fear had nearly broken us. But something stronger had held us together. Something I hadn't felt before. Determination, responsibility. The understanding that war wasn't about one battle, but about what you did after you survived it. An officer approached, stopping briefly in front of our small group. "Well fought today," he said, voice solemn. "We held the ground and pushed them back. But stay sharp. This was only a scouting force." He looked toward the distant trees as if he could already see the next storm gathering there. "The main Confederate line is not far ahead. Yorktown is waiting." The name settled over us like a cold wind. Yorktown. Word had spread in rumors. Fortifications, earthworks, mile after mile of trenches. A fortress dug into the peninsula, defended by men who knew every river crossing and every swamp path. If today's skirmish had been a test, Yorktown would be the judgment. Thompson let out a long breath. "Well," he said quietly, "I suppose we know what tomorrow brings." Larson glanced at Jensen. "And the next day, and the day after that." Nigh neutral, I looked at my hands. They were blackened with powder, shaking just enough that I noticed. The musket felt heavier now, as if it understood what lay ahead better than I did. The forest ahead grew darker as shadows lengthened, branches swaying in the wind like warnings. "Help me up," Jensen murmured. "You sure?" I asked. "Yes," he said. "I want to stand with the rest of you." I slipped my arm under his and lifted him carefully. He grimaced at the pain, but once on his feet he stood straighter than I expected. Looking out over the trees where the smoke still drifted, I felt the weight of what we'd survived and the greater weight of what was coming. Yorktown. The name echoed inside my skull like a low drumbeat. A place none of us had seen, but all of us feared. As the regiment began to form again, preparing to march deeper into the peninsula, I took one last look at the ridge where we had held the line, where fear had become grit, where the enemy had pushed us to the brink, and we had not broken. Whatever waited behind Yorktown's walls, we would face it together. Jensen leaning on us when needed, Thompson's steady humor cutting the fear, Larson's stubbornness holding the cracks together. The forest ahead felt darker than before, but step by step, we would walk into it, because there was no turning back now. "Knee move at dawn," an officer called, And with that, the line began to march toward Yorktown, toward the unknown, toward the next shadow in the peninsula's long, winding path.